this webinar for everyone. And it'll go up on YouTube for anyone who has to drop off, or if you want to send this around to your friends, family, etc. Anyone who's interested in talking about PFAS. So hello, let me introduce myself. My name is Emily Silence. I am the Development Associate at Potomac Riverkeeper Network. Just a little bit about Potomac Riverkeeper Network. We're a small nonprofit that has a big impact in our watershed. We work in the on the Potomac River and on the Shenandoah River. Riverkeepers are kind of boots on the ground, eyes on the water group. We're very action heavy, enforcement heavy, looking to go after polluters. Our Upper Potomac Riverkeeper Brent has joined us today. He's one of our 3 riverkeepers who patrols our waterways on a regular basis. And you know, part of being a waterkeeper is just how important it is to be monitoring our waterways, because obviously we want to protect and safeguard them and make sure that everyone has access to clean water. So a little bit of housekeeping today. I know I have everyone on mute. You're welcome to turn your video on. Please feel free to type in the chat box. I know our lovely speakers can get to, we'll be able to get to your questions at the end. So we do have a reserved time for Q&A at the end, or we can kind of, you know, answer questions throughout. I know there was a few people that submitted questions prior, so I'll try to answer those first. So I want to introduce our speakers. So today we've got, like I said, Brent Walls. He's our Upper Potomac Riverkeeper. He works on the area from Harper's Ferry up to the headwaters of our river, of the Potomac River, which is in Pennsylvania. So he patrols and monitors that part of the waterway. We also have with us Emily Scarr, she is the PIRG State Director, which stands for Public Interest Research Group, if you're unfamiliar with that. And we also have with us Maryland Delegate Sarah Love, who both of them are going to be talking about the legislation, the George Walter Taylor Act, that is being debated right now in Maryland. So prior to that, so we're going to get started with that. I know Emily wanted to show just a quick video kind of talking about PFAS to get us started. So Emily, why don't we kick off with that, and then we can get started just talking about the legislation.
Sure. Let me just share my screen.
Let's not beat around the bush here. The chemicals are toxic. They are known as forever chemicals. They do not easily break down. Instead, they accumulate in the environment and in the human body.
Well, I guess my question to you is, when you take your children and your grandchildren trick-or-treating, do you let them have mystery candy? Why in the world are we allowing ourselves to drink mystery chemicals?
PFAS or PFAS are polyfluoroalkyl substances or perfluoroalkyl substances. They're also known as forever chemicals because they are pretty persistent in the environment.
You know, there's an old saying that says nothing lasts forever. Unfortunately, nothing, that is, except for fluorinated chemicals.
These chemicals have been used in a lot of different products, from microwave popcorn bags to Teflon pans to firefighting foam. And they're effective at those uses because they are water resistant, they resist oil, and they're also pretty heat proof. PFAS chemicals were first discovered in 1938, accidentally actually, by DuPont scientists. They were used a few years later in the Manhattan Project and some of the uranium research. And once that was declassified, they became more prevalent in consumer goods.
Some of these chemicals are associated with a number of negative health effects. It's estimated that 97% of Americans have detectable concentrations of PFAS in their blood.
But it's hard to say exactly what health effects each of them will have. There's a lot of research going on with that now, and some of what we can tell is that some of these chemicals affect infant birth weight, they affect cholesterol, they affect the developmental and immune systems, and there may be others as well.
In Melvindale, in my district, PFAS just oozed out of the ground into the roadway, and residents are still searching for answers about where it came from.
PFAS chemicals are getting into our waterways in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's through groundwater near military bases, if the military base had used firefighting foam that contains PFAS. In other cases, the town might be near a landfill that has PFAS leaking into the groundwater as well. There are a lot of water treatment plants around the country that are looking to figure out how to take the PFAS out of their water supply. There is a way to do it that's fairly easy, but a little bit expensive. You can install carbon filtration. There are other ways that some other water utilities are experimenting with to remove different types of PFAS from their water.
Communities across the nation have asked us to provide a comprehensive approach to understanding PFAS, protecting drinking water.
The EPA has set advisory levels for PFOA and PFOS. Those are two different kinds of PFAS chemicals in drinking water, but that guidance is not necessarily enforceable. So there are some lawmakers on Capitol Hill that are interested in trying to push the EPA toward a more enforceable guideline or regulation for PFAS in drinking water. And there's a lot of attention to that, especially from the towns that are most affected by this.
New Jersey and other states have repeatedly urged the EPA to move forward with setting nationwide regulatory limits for PFAS under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, but the EPA has been very slow to act. New Jersey therefore had no choice but to move ahead to set its own guidelines.
Some states like Massachusetts and New Jersey have decided that they're not going to wait on the EPA to try to give them guidance on how to regulate drinking water. So they're moving forward with their own limits in some cases, or just guidance. And a lot of other states are sort of looking to them as leaders in this area. A lot of communities are calling for stronger federal action on PFAS chemicals, and it's going to be hard for the EPA and other agencies to ignore that. You can expect to see a lot closer attention to these chemicals from not only the EPA, but also the FDA and others on this in the next couple of years.
To date, however, the EPA has yet to act, but it's time for much more than just that. It's time for us in Congress to take long overdue action. It's time for us to push for stronger standards, invest in cleanup, and improve protections for those who have suffered from the effects of contamination.
We go.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much, Emily. Brent, why don't you go ahead and get started talking about the George Walter Taylor Act?
Well, I will share my screen and get that started here real quick. Don't mind me with my big old headphones. I just like to pretend that I'm a pilot. I'm navigating you all through this rocky system here. All right. So trying to get this thing to start. There we go. All right. So I would like to introduce Delegate Sarah Love. First off, her and Senator Sarah Elfreth have both sponsored bills, one in the Senate, one in the House this year, called the George Walter Taylor Act, which is similar to what we were trying to push through on both the House and the Senate last year. And this is a piece of legislation that really stops the use of PFAS with firefighting foam, food packaging, rugs, and carpets. But I am going to let Delegate Love talk more about that. And then Emily Scarr with PERG is going to fill us in on a little bit of the details of what she is wanting, what we are wanting everyone on this call to do, and also share with your friends to do. So Delegate Love, if you would be so kind.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brent, and thank you for your support of this legislation this year and last year. Really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. Delegate Sarah Love. I represent District 16 in the Maryland General Assembly. So that's parts of Potomac, Bethesda, Chevy Chase on the western edge, right up against the Potomac River. So water in the Potomac River is really important to me. I have been sponsoring bills on PFAS for the last 3 years. You've seen a little bit about how toxic they are. And it's really terrifying how ubiquitous they are. They are everywhere. Like you heard, they're in popcorn bags, they are in, you think about those takeout food containers, and the reason the food doesn't end up in your lap is because there's this layer oftentimes of PFAS that is preventing it from going through. So together with the environmental community and the firefighting community, we have brought forth this bill. As you see, it's named after Walter Taylor, who was a 31-year firefighter who died from PFAS-related cancer in 2020. What the bill would do is it would ban the use of firefighting foam with intentionally added PFAS. It would stop the sale of food packaging with intentionally added PFAS and stop the sale of rugs and carpets with intentionally added PFAS. So a number of states have already done each of these, and the industry is moving there as well. You know, anybody from McDonald's to Cava, Home Depot, and Lowe's are all phasing out PFAS in their products. So happy to be here, happy to answer any questions, and that's a brief summary of what the bill does.
Thank you, Delegate. Emily, so we've been working with a large group of concerned organizations and with citizens and trying to make calls and, you know, get connected with our legislators. Can you tell us some updates?
Yeah, so I've been working on toxic chemical issues in Maryland for about a decade now. And unfortunately, I think PFAS has gotten more attention. And I think that attention will just grow in the next couple of years as people see the pervasive risks of PFAS in our drinking water, our food, all of our waterways. So thanks to Delegate Sarah Love and Senator Alfrith, it looks like we might be moving towards a vote in the Senate and in the House in the upcoming weeks, maybe as soon as Friday in the Senate. So we really want to make sure our legislators hear from their constituents. So I'm encouraging folks to call your state senator and your state delegates. I'll drop the link if you don't know who they are of how to find your elected officials, and just encourage them to support SB 273 and HB 275. So this is an emerging issue, as Delegate Love said. We've had it for a couple of years, but this is not climate change. This is not something most elected officials are deeply educated on or necessarily hearing a lot about. So getting calls into their offices is really critical for them to pay attention. They literally see hundreds, thousands of bills cross their desks. They usually don't notice a bill until they have to vote on it the next day. So getting a phone call really helps make sure they see it. They know where you stand. So I'd really encourage folks to make a call into their legislator's office. Anything else you want me to touch on, Brett?
No, I think that's it. I know that, you know, we've done a lot of work recently in, you know, just trying to get the message out there. And I just can't say enough about having that direct communication with your senator or your delegate, and letting them know that it's important for this legislation to pass. You know, some of the opposition that I've heard, that we've all have heard on this bill, is kind of goes down to two paths. One path is don't lump all of the PFAS chemicals into, you know, one term. You know, we should really focus on the individual pollutants, but that's not the way that we need to go. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the PowerPoint as we move on. And the other is there's a lot of other products out there, especially in the medical industry, where the PFAS contained in these products for the medical use is necessary at the moment. And there isn't a lot of research on whether or not that is bad for the process or for the health industry. And so, you know, we just want to be really clear that this is only going towards food packaging, rugs, carpets, and firefighting foam. That is it. It is not involving all these other different products. And at the same time, there's a sentiment that, well, let's wait for the federal government to regulate this stuff. Well, I'll talk about that in my PowerPoint as well, that they've known about it for a good number of years and they still have not regulated. Should we wait for the industries themselves to throttle back and not produce these materials with PFAS in it? We can't wait for them. So we have to do things now. And so I really implore everyone to pick up the phone and call their legislators right now or this week, because it's imminent. We need to pass this legislation. All right. Emily Silence, do we have any questions for Delegate Sarah Love or Emily Scar?
Why don't we get to questions at the end?
All right. I just wasn't sure of Delegate Sarah Love's time and whether or not she's going to be there at the end. So, Ms. Love, if at any time you have to go because of conflicts or whatever, let us know, and if we can answer questions then.
Thank you.
All right, excellent. All right, so moving on, I just wanted to do it real quick. I only have about 15 slides, so that's pretty short for me when it comes to PFAS. So you guys are all very lucky. And I'll try and be short and condensed. We're going to talk a little bit about what is PFAS. You saw the video. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail just to kind of highlight some aspects of PFAS. We're going to talk about some updates with AMDE and the drinking water assessment. We're going to talk about the Piscataway PFAS fish advisory that came out recently. The exposure assessment results in the Martinsburg area by the CDC and Agency for Toxic Substance Disease Registry. We're also going to talk a little bit about Virginia PFAS updates and then what our plans are for 2022. So basically, what is PFAS? Well, you've heard quite a bit in that video, and I'm hoping that everyone here is starting to really slowly educate themselves on what PFAS is and what products PFAS is in. And the reason why it's in so many different products is because of the heat resistant, the virtually unbreakableness, and the fact that it does resist water. Now, at the same time, though, I have to say that PFAS does like water because it can be brought through the hydrological system, through the groundwater. It attaches quite easily to water molecules. It does not like fats, but it depends on where that chain is connected to, right? So you have the chain at the bottom, PFOA. We have all the blues, and then you have the red fluorine atoms. So it depends on which end that chain is attached to. So if it is attached to a TFL pan and it doesn't like oils and fats, then you have one end of the chain that's protecting that pan layer from the fats and the oils of the foods that you cook. Or if it's in a waterproofing product, the other side is attached to that product, and therefore the fatty side of that chain is repelling the water. And in the firefighting foam case, it is just a foam producing kind of chemical, PFOA specifically. And so it's quite unique, actually. And the other thing too, just trying to get home, is that it bioaccumulates, it builds. So even small amounts, and we're going to talk about numbers today. We're going to talk about how small this stuff is. It builds and builds and builds. It adds into your system. It attaches to the proteins in our blood and in our tissues. And so it builds up in the tissues, not just our tissues, but also it builds up into the tissues of plants, and it builds up in the tissues of other, especially like aquatic species. So where is all this stuff? I mean, it's in shampoos, it's in stain resistant products. You may not have TFL pans in the store, but you still have nonstick pans that is using some derivative of that same PFOA chemical. It may be a shorter chain, but it still has that same or similar properties, and it still is potentially toxic to our bodies. It's in our foods because it's in a system, and I'm going to talk about the PFAS cycle, but it's been around for a very, very long time. I mean, it was discovered in the 1930s produced economically by 3M in the 1940s. I mean, you can see the long history here to where, it's been around for such a long time. And in the 1960s is when it was already being used. It's being produced, it's put out there into the environment, and it's already known to be toxic. And then EPA learns about this toxicity, 20 years later, and they still don't do anything about it. And then that was in 1998. So it just has a long history of being in our environment, and it is in all of us. And in probably just about every person in the industrialized world, because of these different products that you see here, and many, many, many more. So if you have waterproof makeup, if you have waterproof sunscreen, all of that stuff has some form of PFAS in it, PFAS. It may not be PFOA or PFOS, but it has some form of that chain. So anything that is water resistant, waterproof, any materials, it's going to have that PFAS in it. So the toxicity of PFAS, really, we have to look at the numbers. And that's where things get a little bit murky, because sometimes numbers are reported in different, at different concentrations. So the EPA drinking water guidance sets 70 parts per trillion for PFAS, and that is a combination of PFOA plus PFOS. But a lot of times that number is reported in different forms, so parts per billion or parts per million. And so you really have to understand what all of that means. And what is 1 part per trillion? Well, I mean, looking at the graph over here on the right, you have 1 drop of PFAS or any of the PFAS pollutants in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. That's how much it's diluted. And that 1 drop of 1 part per trillion, you add that up to a few parts per trillion, it becomes extremely toxic to us. But 70 parts per trillion has always been this, like, why is it 70 parts per trillion when you have other states out there that are looking at much smaller numbers? So you can look at Michigan PFAS limits that they just came out with a year or so ago. You have PFOA and PFOS, among others, 8 nanograms per liter. There we go again. Nanograms per liter also is considered parts per trillion. Sometimes it's reported in micrograms per liter, sometimes it's reported in milligrams per liter. So you really have to be careful about the nomenclature for each of these pollutants when everything is reported. But you look at these numbers and you add PFOA and PFOS in Michigan, and that's a 24 nanogram per liter limit in drinking water, which is a third of the 70 parts per trillion drinking water guidance by the EPA. So obviously there is a disconnect with what EPA thinks is good and what other states really think that is the way that it should be. But this all adds to what this is a PFAS cycle. This literally is a cycle because it is a forever chemical. It does not break down very well. In order to stop PFAS, we have to filter it out or stop the use of it, at the source. And so the focus has been on drinking water, which is great because that's how we, are consuming water. That's the most direct way that it impacts our body, but it also impacts us in other ways. It's on, like what we said, food packaging materials, and it's in other treated materials that we use every single day, which goes through our systems, which goes into the wash machines, into the dishwasher, then into the sewer system, and then into our wastewater treatment plants. It goes back into the river, and then we use the river as a source of water for drinking. We use the river for the source of irrigating our crops. We use the biosolids that come from the separation at the wastewater treatment plant to put on our farm fields to increase the fertilization. So all of this is a huge chain where we have really no clue what the PFAS levels are at each one of those chains. We're just now discovering the levels in the different materials that we eat. We're just now hearing about levels of PFAS and biosolids that has been translated into products that can be consumed. And we're just now learning about what PFAS levels are in wastewater treatment plants. So the PFAS numbers, I know this is a busy slide, and but this is kind of showing the chaos of the numbers that are out there. We have a concentrated effort by the government right now to look at drinking water facilities associated with military bases and the primary use of the AFFF foam, and what kind of contamination there is on those public sources. But we also have other industries that are looking at what is the level of PFAS in various different products. You see in the green there various different products from different, makeups. And then you have other products like bread, lettuce, salmon, milk, cheese. So, we're just now starting to realize that there's these PFAS levels in all these different products that are slowly absorbed into us or get into our environment and into that PFAS cycle. And you can look at the numbers, 12,000 to 32,000 parts per trillion in milk from cows that were fed on fields where PFAS biosolids were spread out. That happened up in Maine, and that's happened actually in a couple other different places. Right here at home, 126,000 parts per trillion were the groundwater levels around the Air National Guard base in Martinsburg. Now, mind you, this is the location of where that source of PFAS came from that migrated through the hydraulic system underground and into the Bing Spring water, which was the source of the public water system in Martinsburg, which had to be shut down in 2016. To now, some recent information in the last year or so of 220,000 to 574,000 parts per trillion of PFAS in the blood plasma of smallmouth bass that were caught in the upper Potomac area. So what does that mean though? What does all of that mean? How does it impact us? How does the blood plasma in the smallmouth bass impact us when the levels are at hundreds of thousands of parts per trillion and we have a drinking water guidance of just 70 parts per trillion? So there's so much information out there that it's just trying to grasp what is what and how the numbers relate to the toxicity to us. And one way to do that right now is like with MDE, they just recently put out in October 2021, a fish advisory for Piscataway Creek, because there was a military base that used AFFF that polluted that Piscataway Creek. And samples, after sampling and assessing the PFAS levels in fish tissue, they came up with an advisory. And you can see on the map here where you have yellow bullhead catfish, red breast sunfish, and large mouth bass, and you have various different limits for general population, women, and children. And so that is, you can only eat so much before you're going to, they feel potentially exposed to harmful levels of PFAS. They've also looked at, which I thought was quite interesting, is the recreational swimming screening concentrations. So if these concentrations are found in the river, then it's not ideal to be recreating in that river with those kind of concentrations. So we're going to be looking at that very closely. And at the same time, in order to develop that advisory, they had to have some level of screening. How do they screen the fish? What levels of PFAS are in the fish that dictate whether or not there should be a fish advisory? Well, in this case, you can see all the way on the right the different levels. Now, this is in, again, micrograms per, I think, kilogram. The screens are blocking me. So you have to be careful about what that means. Well, remember, nanograms is more around the parts per trillion. So that really means 73,000 parts per trillion is the screening concentration for PFAS in fish tissue that would trigger whether or not there should be an advisory. So then you compare that to the 70 parts per trillion EPA drinking water guidance. So where is the disconnect? Well, part of the disconnect is supposedly we drink more water. I know I don't. I should drink more water, but we should be drinking lots and lots of water. And because we're exposed to lots of water, because we drink lots of water, that limit is lower. And that at the same token, if we're only exposed to so much fish a month, then the levels can be much higher. But there still really isn't a whole lot of science out there as to whether or not that is specifically true. This is just, in my opinion, kind of a best guess. I haven't seen the literature. There might be some out there, but I haven't seen the literature that's specific. But it really just plays into question, why do we have to, why can't we take this information and move forward with it and stop the source of PFAS, put in, other actions that stop the cycle of PFAS that's getting into our waters and streams. I already talked about the 220 parts per trillion smallmouth PFAS in smallmouth bass in the blood plasma. And then USGS submitting plasma in fish. So this is what's really interesting. I know Vicki Blazer is on, and we love her very, very much. She has gotten reinvigorated and focused on PFAS in her intersex fish studies, trying to figure out, well, all right, PFAS is kind of a hot thing. Let's see what the PFAS levels are in some of my older plasma and tissue samples. And so a lot of that information has been sent in, and we're waiting on results that could really tell us how widespread the problems are. And we can use that information to really start pushing on states. What else MDE has done during the time and probably before the fish advisory is they first started out assessing the public water systems. They did submit out a report. They tested 463 systems, 13% tested, 70% of the population. So that's, their best way of trying to figure out what kind of impacts there are. And, as much coverage as what they could possibly get with the limited funds that they have, because PFAS testing is not cheap. 131 systems were tested, 75% had measurable results. 17 had results between 10 and 35 parts per trillion. This is the combination of PFOA and PFOS. 2 systems had 35 to 70 parts per trillion, a combination of PFOA and PFOS. That was Westminster and Hampstead. So what this is telling us is that there are significant levels out there. To me, even 17% of the facilities that have parts per trillion, 10 to 35 parts per trillion, to me is very significant. But more needs to be done. And I think their plan was in 2021 to expand to another 68 drinking water systems. We haven't seen the report, not really sure what the results are. We're looking forward to that information when it comes out. And you can see in the map the locations of where they were collecting samples from different public water systems. Continuing on with MDE, they have a number of different assessments that they want to move forward with. One has been recently completed, not really necessarily an assessment, but at least it's progress. It's looking at what the levels of PFAS are in biosolids and in the effluent to the Naval Support Indian Head facility. So that's, to me, remarkable, trying to establish some understanding of the effluent and biosolids, which is exactly what we've been wanting the state to do, is really to, what are the levels of PFAS in biosolids? What are the levels in our effluents? We sampled effluents in the Antietam Creek and shown significant levels of PFAS that are being discharged into Antietam Creek from Hagerstown and Smithsburg. Both of those facilities really do not have any major industrial users of PFAS. So the PFAS is coming from somewhere. And even those rural facilities have significant levels. That means a lot of facilities throughout the state, both in highly urban areas and highly industrial areas, have equal or more, or at least, they should be assessed on whether or not there's going to be significant levels. They're trying to make some progress in the fish tissue assessment, looking at their website and reviewing some of the materials. They've focused on Eastern Shore. They said that there's no levels of PFAS that they have found, but I question that, and there's no specific information on if they found any levels or if they just didn't find any levels that pass the criteria, the screening criteria that they've already established for Piscataway Creek. It also looks like they're only going to be working on targeted watersheds, not going to be doing a full-blown assessment through the MBSS program like I thought they were going to be doing. So we're going to continue to push on fish tissue assessments in Maryland. They've done they said that they're going to be doing an industrial stormwater permit review. So looking at industrial stormwater permits and trying to figure out whether or not they should assess PFAS levels in those permits for monitoring purposes. Industrial and municipal screening. I think there was a focus on the 15 wastewater treatment plants for screening. Still haven't seen any of the data on that, so we're hoping that they actually come forward with that. And again, more widespread municipal biosolid and then also landfill leachate assessment of PFAS is something else that needs to be done. I know that they're considering that. They've done something with the Naples Indian Head facility, but we really need more widespread, especially when you have companies like Synagro here in Hagerstown that's taken the biosolids that we already know has PFAS in the effluent and concentrating that biosolid and then selling that biosolid to farm fields. And so that is the part of the process that we really need to understand and assess. I also indicated about the PFAS exposure assessment that CDC and the Agency for Toxic Substance Disease Registry conducted in 2019 in the Martinsburg area. They tested 275 people out of 165 households. They were really looking for about 300 households, but it was really difficult for people to trust the government and allow themselves to be tested and pricked and prodded and surveyed, because the CDC folks, they came into all these different homes and tested rugs, tested the air quality, sampled dust, sampled their water, and then also did a survey with all the individuals to find out what they eat, what they drink, where they get their food, how long they've been in the area, that kind of thing. So it was a pretty intensive process. Not a whole lot has come out of it. They did find that there were some high levels of PFH, small x, large s, which is something that's also contained in AFFF, just like PFOS. And it just reiterated that the source of the contamination was coming from the Air National Guard base in their AFFF use, which contaminated the groundwater, contaminated the spring that the public water system used. What also was interesting in the exposure assessment results was a recommendation to, adjust what products you use to try and limit the different waterproofing products or the materials or the nonstick pans, to look at your rugs and carpets. But they also said that you should be aware of any local fish advisories. And that's where we're focused on right now, because the source is from this Air National Guard base that not only impacted the spring, that was the water supply for the public system, but it also impacted two of the streams in that area, Evans Run and Cold Spring Run. I don't have a finishing slide for that. And so, I'll get down a little bit later into what we're doing, but that has real connection to what we want to try and do in the West Virginia area is develop a fish advisory, push the state to develop a fish advisory based on sampling of fish in the Peckin Creek in and around where the base is. Some news from the PFAS front in Virginia. This is coming from Philip Masigas, our director of litigation and all things political in Virginia. He has been pretty instrumental in being part of this work group, PFAS work group, that the 2020 legislation developed. And, it's essentially the same kind of process. They are looking at the public water as a first primary direction. However, they only did about 2.5% of the different facilities out there. And you can see some of the results here. 14 of the 63 sampled sites had 20 parts per trillion or less. One facility had 57 parts per trillion of a PFAS chemical that is actually analogous to Gen X, which is supposed to be the replacement of PFOA. To me, I think that's quite significant. Because I know the industry is trying to, hey, we're going to stop using these chemicals, but we're going to use Gen X. But now we're finding extremely high levels of Gen X in our drinking water. And so that's why we need to focus on stopping PFAS as a whole, PFAS as a family, not individual products. Other things, so the other thing too that noted in the results was the water source was coming from the Potomac and the Occoquan Reservoir. Now these were from the facilities that were tested. Those that you can see the concentration of tests in the map itself. And I know that they're wanting to do more monitoring in 2022, but there are some governmental hurdles right now. And VDAC seems to be wanting to kind of branch off from what the government is asking them to do or not do, which hopefully that same momentum is going to continue throughout 2022 and 2023, which they're considering assessing wastewater treatment plants.
Hey, Brent.
Yeah.
Since Delegate Love has to jump at 12:45, I'm just going to give her a chance to say anything.
Yeah, I'm on my last slide, so yeah, please.
If you want to say anything, Delegate Love, before we get into.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Brent, and everyone. I will just echo what Emily and Brent said. We listen to our constituents, and so these calls and emails and all of that really, really matter. So given how important this is and how close we are to a vote, I really want to echo their call to have you contact your legislators. Thank you everyone so much. I put my email in the chat if you had any other questions, and appreciate your time.
Thank you, Delegate Love. I really appreciate you being on with us today.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So like I said, this is my last slide. Just talking about what the actions that we're doing now. We have in the past done some sampling in the Antietam Creek. We've done some sampling in the Opequon Creek watershed around the Air National Guard base. What we're doing from now going forward is trying to build on top of some of that information that we've collected in the past. And we're going to continue to press MDE to do some fish consumption advisories, especially in the Antietam Creek, where we already have some known information about wastewater treatment plants, information about background levels in the stream, and levels of smallmouth bass that have been caught near Antietam Creek. So we're going to continue to push for fish consumption advisories. We're going to continue to push for biosolid assessments, and we'll probably end up needing some help down the road through this process in getting the state MDE to do more of these kinds of assessments. So be prepared to help us out and get on a list and start sending some letters. So, and then at the same time, they said that they're going to be bringing us some municipal and industrial and PDS permits and effluent assessments. So we're going to continue to try and get that information so we can better assess what's going on with PFAS. In West Virginia, we're in the process, and we've collected some fish late last fall, and we're wanting to continue that this year and into the spring to collect a number of fish in the Opequon Creek so that we can have that sent off to the same lab that USGS is sending their fish samples to assess the PFAS levels. And the focus is because in 2018 we collected samples that had extremely high levels of PFAS in Evans Run and Cold Spring Run. And if it's high in those streams and the rivers and the fish are swimming in those rivers, chances are they're going to be exposed, and they're going to have also high levels of PFAS in them. And we do have a lot of cultural and low income families that routinely collect fish in the Opequon Creek. So, we really are cognizant of wanting to make sure that people are safe. Air National Guard is doing an expanded assessment. They did one around their facility and on their facility, but now they're going to expand and collect samples at the same exact sites that we collected samples at Evans Run and Cold Spring Run. So we're looking forward to looking at that information to see if it backs up and continues the information that we have highlighted and shown. And then ultimately, we really want to have a consumption advisory in that area. So far, which is interesting, there are no consumption advisories in the state of West Virginia, even though that's where DuPont is from and has significant problems of PFAS contaminating their environment in that town. Yet there are no fish advisories in West Virginia. So it might be a bit of an uphill battle, but we're going to push to try and do that. We're going to continue to stay active in the work group in Virginia. And we're going to continuously try and push public awareness. So every Friday, I'm going to be doing a PFAS Friday fun fact. Maybe not fun fact, but it's PFAS Friday fact. Just to kind of continue to get the information out there. Because even just the other day, I was at the Polar River Plunge in DC, and someone who I thought was well educated into the science of water quality and things didn't have any idea what PFAS was. And I'm sure there are lots and lots of people out there that just do not know what it is and what products that it's in. So keeping on the public awareness and information is key. With that, I will take some questions.
All right, awesome. There was a few questions that were submitted when folks registered, so I'm going to ask those first. So first one, I'm curious about the state of the Potomac and Maryland area with PFAS contamination and what can be done about it. As consumers, how do we protect ourselves and how do we get our communities / government to protect us from these chemicals?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. There's a lot of parts to that, isn't there? What can we do to protect ourselves and to protect our community? And I think, well, like we've heard today, just starting to develop stopping the chain, stopping the PFAS cycle. And one of those is to at least stopping some of the use of various different products that we know have PFAS in it that contaminate our bodies, contaminate our environment. So again, imploring to protect your community by, helping us call our legislators and our senators to have them support this PFAS bill is start number one. Number two, to kind of help protect yourself, just start being more cognizant of the products that you use. If it has something that's waterproof, you might want to question whether or not it's necessary. Is it necessary to have something that's waterproof? Is it necessary to have that waterproof makeup, have that waterproof sunscreen, to have that waterproofing material, the Scotch Guard, spray it on their couch, or stain resistant? Because anything that's stain resistant also has some form of PFAS in it. So just be cognizant of the different products that we use, and knowing that PFAS gets passed through us and into the streams and into our treatment plants. It gets passed through and leached off of products in the wash machine, in the dishwasher. So just be aware, I think is key.
Sorry, I was going to add, and apologies for my daughter's noise in the background. Yeah, I think what we're doing with this law is partly strategic, right? We're passing, taking out some of the low-hanging fruit and also the sources of PFAS contamination that are most directly likely to harm our waterways and get into our food through food packaging and the foam. It's certainly not using all uses, but if enough states do that, and a lot of states have, it opens the door and makes it easier both for the federal government to take action and also just signals to manufacturers and producers not to use this stuff. So oftentimes, like the person making your rugs and carpets, they're not a scientist. It's the chemical industry selling the, saying here's a chemical, it'll make your products better. And we have a really strong ability to enforce the market that way too. So a lot of what's happened to clear the way for these legislations is consumer pressure, is Lowe's, Home Depot refusing to sell rugs and carpets that contain this material. It's Whole Foods. Once we found there was testing done to find PFAS in their salad bowls, and doing testing at McDonald's and Burger King that found PFAS in their packaging, and then they push the manufacturers of their food packaging to come up with alternatives. And so once there's a known alternative, it makes it easier then to pass a law at a state and another state and federally. So in some regards, what we're doing is small compared to the problem, but it is strategic. Brent's talked a lot about what we need to do next on testing and limits. And I've been saying pretty loudly, we need to set up liability to hold polluting industry accountable. Otherwise, we're going to have all these limits, but the government's going to be on the hook for remediation, which we learned from lead doesn't work that well. We still have lead contaminating our pipes in our homes in Baltimore and across the state. So my focus, knock on wood, if we pass this, is to sort of focus on making sure we have the liability and standards set up next. And I think someone said what we know about how much it's in the water. We don't have required testing yet. MDE tested 70% of the community drinking water last year and found some level of PFAS in 75% of the drinking water they tested. So that's pretty alarming.
Thanks, guys. There was another question about how PFAS affects fish. As in, how does it affect the fish?
Well, I mean, as in, does it negatively impact the health of the fish, and whether or not that's a big question. That is really a big question. I think that's part of the toxicology of PFAS and what levels are going to be impacting not only us, but also other species. And that's still an unknown. And I know that that's one of the questions that Vicky Blazer with USGS has at the moment.
There was another question. Does distilling water remove PFAS?
No, it does not. Distilling water does not remove PFAS. Now, so you'd heard in the video, and what also was done at the Big Spring water treatment plant there in Martinsburg was to put in a charcoal filter. So using some kind of a charcoal filter is one of the best ways to reduce the levels of PFAS in your drinking water. So, you know, any kind of charcoal filter that's into your whole house filter, or even the Brita water filters that have that charcoal base might add some level of protection for PFAS. But, you know, there again, what we come up with is that another source of PFAS contamination. So that charcoal that's filtering out all the PFAS at that Big Spring water plant, where does that go? And how do we protect our environment from wherever that goes? All right,
Great.
next.
Can we review what illnesses / cancers PFAS is connected with?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a whole host of them out there related to cancer and high cholesterol, breast cancer, testicular cancer, you know, and the jury is still out on exactly what, what levels that a human body has to have in them before they're going to see that that kind of impact on their bodies. Right now, the science is out there. It's correlating. It says that these people have this amount of PFAS in their system. Out of that amount of people, there is this many people that have those kinds of related cancers. So we don't have that specific number just yet. You know, and that's why the CDC and the Agency for Toxic Disease Substance, you know, they didn't come out with specific numbers. They didn't want to say, because you have this level of PFAS in your system, you are X amount of percent likely to get this kind of cancer. We just don't have the science that says that yet. Unless somebody knows something different, I am all ears.
There was a question that said, on the slide with the US map showing military sites, drinking water sites, and other known sites, Virginia shows just 2 drinking water dots. Is that just because there has been limited testing?
Yes. That's, I mean, I think this is the slide, correct? This is the military sites, the drinking water sites. You know, the focus was for these folks in military bases connected to a public water system. And so that's been, now I have some personal thoughts on why they went that way, but I mean, that was just one primary track that they had to follow because of the widespread use of that AFFF found.
Great. Next question. There is bacteria strains along with iron breakdown PFAS. Has there been any progress on using this method?
What was it? What was that again?
There is bacteria strains along with iron breakdown PFAS. Has there been any progress on using this method?
See, limited progress. I mean, that is the question out there, is trying to find a system or a bacterial system or a natural system that can break down PFAS and make it less of a toxic chemical. And how do we dispose of it? That is, that's a huge issue out there. And a lot of research is now being put into it. But as far as I know, I do not know of anything.
Yeah, the EPA is looking a lot at burning at really, really, really high temperatures, which obviously concerns of it then going into our air and back into our water.
Yep.
They're researching this now and may come out with some guidance this fall. I don't know if I'll be happy with it, but and burning is the other thing that they're looking at closely. A little scary.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I think we're going to go ahead and end it there. Thank you so much, Brent and Emily, for joining us and talking about PFAS today. As you heard before, please contact your legislators about the Maryland bill. Obviously very important that we regulate PFAS as much as possible. And also donate to Potomac Riverkeeper Network, because we do a lot of work on PFAS and many other issues in the watershed as well too. So we do usually monthly Water Wednesdays, so feel free to pick another one, learn about some other topics that we're working about. I will send everyone a link to this recording and with our contact info and the link to the action alert too that our group Waterkeepers Chesapeake has sent out as well.
And Emily, can you send out the PDF of the slides, I guess, if
Sure. Yeah,
also.
yeah, I can send out the slides too. Emily and Brent, anything to? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your week.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.